Okay, let's begin. We're in Vayeshev. It's the third Aliyah, so it's Lamed Zayin Chof Gimel through Lamed Zayin Lamed Vav. It's page 204 in the Art Scroll. It's the sale of Yosef. So this is what the Aliyah is all about. Everybody's with me? Pasuk Chof Gimel, Lamed Zayin Chof Gimel, page 204. Vayihi ka'asher ba Yosef Elachav. Vayfshitu es Yosef et kutanto es kuton es hapasim asher alav. And it was when Yosef came to his brothers, they stripped Yosef of his tunic, the fine woolen tunic that was on him. So they ripped off the coat that his father had given him. Vayikachuhu vayishlichu oso habora v'habor reik ein bo mayim. Pasuk Chav Dalet. And what did they do? Then they took him and they cast him into the pit. And the famous words, and the pit was empty, no water was in it. Rashi, of course, says there was no water, but there were snakes inside, right? Okay. Vayeshvu le'achol lechem, vayisu einehem, vayu v'nei orchos yishmelim ba migilad ugemalhem nosim nechos utzir valot holchim lo read mitzrayma. And what do they see? And they sat and they sit to eat, and they raise their eyes, and behold, they see a caravan of Ishmaelim who was coming from Gilad, their camels bearing spices, balsam, and lotus on their way to bring it down to Egypt. Pasuk Chofav. Vayomer Yehuda Elachav. Now Yehuda talks to his brothers. Ma betzach es damo. What benefit would it be for us to kill our brother? Lechuvenim karenu la Yishmaelim. You know what? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelim. V'yadenu al tihibo ki achinu v'sarenu. And let not our hands be upon our brother, upon him, for he is our brother after all, right? Vayishmu echav, and they listened to Yehuda. Vayavru anashim mijanim socharim vayimshechu vayalu es Yosef minabor vayimkiru es Yosef laishmaelim be'esrim mikosef vayaviu es Yosef mitzrayma. Pasuk chavches. And the Midianite men, traders, passed by. They threw Yosef up and lifted him out of his pit and sold Yosef to the Ishmaelim for 20 pieces of silver. And then they brought Yosef to Egypt. Who exactly pulled him out of the pit? Who sold him? Who brought him down? Was the Ishmaelim? Was the Midianim? It's not clear. And this is a whole debate among the Meforshim, but this is not what concerns us. This is not what concerned Rav Soloveitchik when he studied this story. But you should know, there's a whole debate because it seems confusing. Who's taking him out of the pit? Who's taking him? Who's selling him? Who's bringing him down to Mitzrayim? There's a lot to be said just on that issue. No, next pasuk, Chavtes. Vayashav Reuven al habor v'nei en Yosef habor vayikra es bigadav. Now Reuven suddenly returns to the pit. He looks into the pit, and behold, he sees that Yosef is not in the pit anymore. Vaikra begadav, and Reuven he does kriya on his clothing. He rips his clothing, just like a mourner. Vayoshav el echov, vayomer hayelet enenu vani anot niba. And he turns to his brothers. This is Reuven, the oldest, and he says, "The boy is gone, and where can I go?" Vaikhu es kitonas Yosef. Vayishchatu sir izim vaytelu es hakitones badam. And they took Yosef's tunic and they slaughtered a goatling and dipped the tunic in its blood. Right? They take the garment of Yosef, the coat, and they dip it in the blood of the sir izim. Now what do? Vayishlechu et ketonos hapasim vayaviu el abiyam vayamru zos matzanu hakir no haketonos binchoi im lo. And they take this ketonos, this tunic, very well, the father knows it very well because this was the special gift that he gave his Yosef, and they dispatched the fine wool tunic and they brought it to their father and they said, "We found this. Identify. Please identify it. Is it your Yosef's? Is it your son's?" And Yosef and Yaakov looks at Vayakira Vayomer Ketonas Bini Chaya Ra'a Achalasu. And suddenly Yaakov, looking at it, he recognizes and he says, it's my son's tunic. A savage beast has devoured him. Yosef has surely been torn to bits, right? He must be dead.
Yes.
Okay. Pasuk Lamed Dalet. Vayikra Yaakov simlosov. So now Yaakov rips his garment. Vayosem sak b'mosnov, and he puts on sack clothing, right? Vayisabel al beno yamim rabim, and he mourns his son many, many days. Vayakumu kol v'nov v'chol b'nosov l'nachamo, and all of his sons and his daughters all come to comfort him. Vayima'ain, and he refuses lisnachem, to be comforted. Vayomer ki ered el b'ni Avel she'ola vayef osa aviv. And he makes this fascinating comment, Yaakov says, and he refused to be comforted, and he said, for I will go down to the grave mourning of my son. What he just meant, that he was going to now be the one who was going to go to the grave. We'll see. This is a powerful statement, what it really means. V'amijanim also el Mitzrayim, and the Mijanim now sell him to Egypt. Lepotifar Sris Paro Sar Hatabachim, and they sell him to Potiphar, who is the Sar Hatabachim. He translates it here as the chamberlain of the butchers. Who were the butchers? He was the one who, according to Onkelos, disagrees with Rashi. He says Potiphar is the one, is the main henchman. He's the one who kills those that are on death row. Okay. This is the Aliyah, Yosef being sold. Let's see what Rav Soloveitchik has to understand in this whole story. But what the Rav probes when he studies this story, these psukim, is fascinating. He wants to understand what makes the brothers tick. In particular, what makes the two leaders of the brothers, namely Reuven and Yehuda, tick. And what is the difference in their personalities? And when he studies that, you see so much more to this story than what we just read in simple pshat. So let's take a look at what the Rav has to say. Let's see Yehuda. Yehuda is the one who recommends that they do what? Well, Reuven does something even before that. Go back to Reuven in Pasuk Chaf Beis, right? What is on page 204, at the very top of 204, right before this aliyah, the last pasuk before this aliyah begins? What did Reuven suggest? Throw him into the pit, right? Reuven, al tishbechu dam hashlichu osol abor azeh asher b'midbar v'yod al tishlichu bo. He's the one who suggested. So Reuven suggested that they put him in the pit. Now, what does Yehuda suggest? Well, let's take a look in pasuk Chavav. Vayomer Yehuda elechav. And Yehuda speaks up. Ma betza ki naharog esochinu v'chisanu estamo. What is Yehuda saying? Ladies, what do you think Yehuda is saying? Is he saying just a pragmatic comment, or is he saying something much more profound? This is what the Rav wants to know. He wants to know, what does this statement by Yehuda tell us? Does it reflect a positive picture of Yehuda, or that he's promoting selling Yosef rather than killing him? Well, that's a good idea, right? Maybe this is projecting Yehuda in a very positive outlook, or maybe no. That's cruel as well. Selling him is also cruel. He's coming up with a compromise. But what does this reflect of Yehuda? Does this reflect of simply a pragmatic approach of Yehuda? Listen, it's not smart if we kill him. That's way too drastic an act, but we should sell him. But what does this tell us of Yehuda? That's what the Rav wants to know. Is Yehuda just acting in a pragmatic fashion? Well, it's not good to kill him, so let's sell him. Is that, or is it reflecting a positive outlook on Yehuda? That's what he wants to know. The idea of selling is also lacking of humanity. So the Rav quotes the Gemara in Sanhedrin Vav Amid Beis. The Gemara says, whoever praises Yehuda for saying, what is the gain if we slay our brother? This pasuk, ma betza, what is the benefit of slaying our brother? The Gemara says is nothing but an abuser, meaning Yehuda is not to be praised for this. The Gemara doesn't look at Yehuda in a positive outlook whatsoever. Yehuda, the two leaders of the brothers, that natural leaders should have been Ruvain, right, who suggested throw him into the boar, and Yehuda is really the fourth son, but he's a very strong personality, as we know. And the Gemara is saying, we don't look positively on what Yehuda recommended to his brothers by not killing his brothers, because the Gemara is looking at it. This was a pragmatic Yehuda. This was not a sympathetic Yehuda. Yehuda is lacking the sympathy. Based on this, the Gemara, the Rav notes, there's a striking difference between Yosef and Yehuda. Yosef and Yehuda end up being
You're muted, Rabbi. You're muted.
Got it. Thank you. Ruvain loses his role as Ruvain loses his role as a leader. We know that. But Yehuda and Yosef become the two leaders of all of the brothers. And the Rav wonders, what is the difference in the nature of these two people? And it's so important to really appreciate this. And so he says, Yosef had a natural ethical nature that was born within him. It was his DNA. Yosef was a sympathetic, moral person to his core. That's who he was. Yosef was compassionate to his dying day. He was the one who never took revenge against his brothers, even though his brothers were worried that he was going to take revenge. He never even thought of revenge. It was beyond his thinking. Yosef has a DNA of compassion. Yosef has a DNA of morality. Yehuda doesn't have this. Yehuda doesn't have this built-in ethical nature, the Rav notes. This wasn't his, if we would put it in modern terminology, it wasn't his psychological DNA. It wasn't his makeup. He had, quote unquote, the Rav, he had a negative and occasionally destructive tendency. Yehuda has, it seems, a negative and at times self-destructive tendencies. Yehuda's conscience puts him here. He says, well, we can't go that far to kill him, but he lacks compassion. He compromises, right? Well, let's not kill him, but let's sell him, which is also cruel, albeit as not as cruel as outright murder. Excuse me. That is why our sages are very critical of Yehuda's suggestion here. It's far from praiseworthy. So the Rav is looking at these two personalities, the Yehuda and the Yosef personality. Yehuda, he says, doesn't deserve praise. Yehuda is a pragmatic leader who's not willing to go all the way and to kill his brother, but he's not also compassionate. He does something terribly cruel. We never want anybody to be sold as a hostage. We know that better than anybody now as we're going through this Gaza war. It is cruel to think of that. So that's why Chazal look at Yehuda not in a praiseworthy perspective. Perhaps we can appreciate the difference between Yosef and Yehuda by quoting a different lecture that I found from the Rav he gave in Boston in 1968. The Rav wasn't talking about Yehuda and Yosef per se, but I feel you'll see in a moment the difference of these two personalities can be really appreciated by what the Rav had to say. In that lecture, the Rav described two personalities that he knew very well. His grandfather, Reb Chaim Brisker, on the one hand, and Albert Einstein, student or colleague on the other, who just so happens to have been a Talmud at one time of Reb Chaim Brisker. His name was Dr. Jacob Gromer. Gromer worked hand in hand. You can Google this. Gromer worked hand in hand with Einstein in his discovery of relativity, of the theory of relativity. Gromer was a brilliant leading mathematician of his time, and was most probably right under Einstein, respected him as a colleague, and they worked together throughout for many, many years. And Gromer had to eventually leave Germany because of the Nazis. And so it was Einstein who recommended to him, why don't you go to Minsk into Russia, where you'll be left alone and you'll be respected as a mathematician. The Rav notes that Gromer is even given credit by many as the main source of Russia's achievements during the 20th century in mathematics, because Gromer was there. Gromer was brilliant. So now the Rav recounts, he once met Gromer and he had a conversation with Gromer. Being Gromer once was a talmid of his grandfather, Reb Chaim. But Gromer left observance, he left being a shomer mitzvos, and he was attracted to mathematics. So the Rav describes his conversation that he had with Gromer. Listen to this. I spoke with him about scientists, and I spoke with him about Reb Chaim. So I spoke about scientists, and I spoke about Reb Chaim. And Gromer told me, I will tell you frankly, when I was in Brisk, I found many faults with Reb Chaim. When I came to Berlin, I realized that Reb Chaim was a saint. Einstein is considered a moral personality, Gromer said, and was indeed, I must admit, a moral personality. It's true, Einstein was a moral person, but Reb Chaim had more chesed in his little finger than Albert Einstein had in his entire heart and his entire brain. The Rav concluded, this is true. This is not that I'm telling you stories. In other words, Gromer compared Reb Chaim's chesed to Einstein's chesed, Reb Chaim's morality to Einstein's morality. And what you see here is Yehuda and Yosef, if you will. Reb Chaim had the personality of a Yosef. Reb Chaim was an ish chesed par excellence. That was his DNA makeup. Yehuda was not. Yehuda was also moral, 100%, but he didn't have the DNA of Reb Chaim, if you will. He didn't have that built-in DNA. He had what Gromer described Einstein, a moral person, but pragmatic, if you will. That's the difference between Yehuda and Yosef. So when Yehuda suggests, let's not kill our brother Yosef, let's sell him, how does Chazal view this statement in this parsha? Not praiseworthy, but pragmatic. It's a pragmatic morality. It's not a built-in morality. It's not a Reb Chaim morality. It's, if you will, an Einstein morality. Morality at the end of the day, but it's a pragmatic one. And that's the difference between the Yosef and Yehuda personality. Very important lesson that we should take into account when we study the differences between these two personalities that now will occupy the rest of Chumash Bereshis, the next 4 parshios, this parsha and the next 3 afterwards. It's really Yosef and Yehuda and the confrontation of Yosef and Yehuda. The personalities are strikingly different. And here, if you will, we're getting the foreshadowing to understand what is going to make these two men tick. Go to Pasuk Chavtes, Lamed Zayin Chavtes. Vayeshev Ruvain el Habor. Now Ruvain returns to the bor. V'nei ein Yosef babor. And he realizes Yosef is not in the pit. Vayikra es bigodov, and he rips his garment. He rips his garment. What does that mean? He does kriya. He goes into avelut. He goes into mourning because his brother is not there. So what's your question? Well, go back to Pasuk Chof Beis. Vayomer alehem Ruvain, al tishlichu dam, yishlichu asol habor hazeh, asher b'mibor v'yod, al tishlichu bo. L'mani tzilos osomi yodom lahashivo el aviv. Tell me, what is that Pasuk Chof Beis at the top of page 204, 205 tell us? And Ruvain said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit, but lay not your hand on him. What was Ruvain's idea? Reuven's idea was always to be the one who was going to return Yosef to his father. He was going to be the savior of Yosef. So what's your question when you read this story? There's one question that jumps off the page. Unmute yourself. You can comment. What do you think? What's the
My question is, where was Reuven from
exactly? Where did Reuven go? Reuven tells him, listen, guys, let's put him into the pit. And the pasuk tells us that Reuven had every intention to bring his brother back to his father. Reuven had planned to be the one who was going to save Yosef. So the question is, what happened? Where did he go all of this time? What took him away from the pit? Where was he? So Rashi quotes the Medrash Rabbah says in the name of Rabbi Elazar, he was taken up in his fasting and sackcloth. When he became free, he went back and looked into the pit. In other words, for some reason, Reuven was davening and mourning and doing tshuva. Davening and mourning and doing tshuva. What was he mourning about? What was he doing tshuva about? So that's the Medrash. The Medrash is referring to an earlier episode. Let's go back to Perek Lamed Hey, Pasuk Chav Beis. Perek Lamed Hey, Pasuk Chav Beis is on page 190. Everybody sees it? It's an earlier story. It's in the parsha beforehand, the previous parsha. Vayi bishkon Yisrael ba'aretz. This is right after Rachel dies, right after Rachel is buried in Beis Lechem, right? Derech Ephrasa. Vayi bishkon Yisrael ba'aretz hahi. Vayelech Ruvain vayishkav es bilha pilegesh aviv. Vayishma Yisrael. Vayu b'nei Yaakov shnei masar. And it came to pass, while Yisrael dwelt in the land, that Reuven went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Yisrael heard. And then there's a big space there, right? An empty space. You see it in the pasuk. And then it says the sons of Yaakov were 12. And then it lists the sons of Yaakov. That's what the Medrash is referring to. The Gemara in Shabbos, Nun Hey Amid Beis 55b states that whoever reads that pasuk that we just read and argues that Reuven actually sinned and lived with the Pilegesh of Yaakov, if his father's Pilegesh Bilhah, is wrong. Why, the Medrash says? Because the Torah tells us right after, in that pasuk, it describes in that pasuk supposedly what he did, but then it says what? There's a big space, and then it says, now the sons of Yaakov were 12, indicating that Reuven was like the rest. Reuven was never abandoned as a sinner. Rather, Reuven was as righteous as the rest. Rashi explains the whole story. You know this, Rashi. Rashi says, when Rachel died, Yaakov took his bed, which was placed regularly in the tent of Rachel, and he placed it in the tent of Bilhah. Bilhah was Rachel's handmaid. So he took, Rachel dies, and what does Yaakov do? He moves his bed that was usually in Rachel's tent, and he moves it to Bilhah. Reuven sees this, and Reuven came, and he felt his mother, Leah, was being insulted by his father. And so what did Reuven do? Reuven said, the Rashi quotes, if my mother, Leah, was subordinate to Rachel, must she also be subordinate to Rachel's handmaid? Therefore, what did Reuven do? He rearranged Yaakov's bed, and he moved Yaakov's bed without his permission from Bilhah's tent back to Leah's tent. In other words, what did he do? Not that he, God forbid, had a sexual rendezvous with the Pilegesh of his father, but rather he moved the bed of Yaakov from the tent of Bilhah back to the tent of Leah. But, okay, fine. That's what the Rashi says, and that's what the Medrash says, and that's what they say. That's where Reuven was all of this time. Remember, let's go back to the question. Let's not get distracted for a moment. The question was, what happened to Reuven? And what's the answer? Well, Reuven was doing tshuva. And for what? So the Medrash tells us he was doing tshuva because he somehow slighted his father. He demonstrated a lack of derech eretz to his father. And what did he do? He moved the bed from the tent of Bilhah back to the tent of Leah. But you have to ask yourself a basic question. What does this have to do with the stale of Yosef? How are you going to fuse these two stories together? Right? There's a medrash here, there's a medrash there. And how do you fuse them together to explain where Ruvain was? So Ruvain was doing tshuva. Why was he doing tshuva now? Why did he suddenly dawn upon him? This happened in last week's parsha. This happened a while back. Why would he suddenly realize, hey, I better do tshuva now for what I did to my father back then? That's the question. Why did Ruvain suddenly feel that he had to repent for a mistake he made in last week's parsha, if you will, about Bilhah and Leah's tent? So the Rav brilliantly demonstrates the two midrashim go hand in hand. The Rav demonstrates the following. Ruvain only now realized that what he had done by moving his father's bed had great implications that he had never taken into account when he had moved the beds. We do actions, but we don't always realize the ramifications of our actions. Ruvain did an action. From the perspective of the action, it was relatively a minor deed. It wasn't a drastic deed, but it had great implications that Ruvain didn't realize until now. Now he realized that the disrespect that he showed his father, he diminished the authority of his father. By moving his father's bed, what was he demonstrating? My father doesn't have a good sense of cheshbon. My father doesn't have a good sense of propriety. He would slight my mother. I'm going to teach my father morality. I'm going to teach my father what's right and wrong. In other words, he undermined the authority of his father Yaakov. He undermined not only authority, he undermined the respect that they had to have for Yaakov's actions. Yaakov, he was saying, is making a mistake. Yaakov is making a mistake, and I'll teach Abba how to really see things correctly. Now, Ruvain was the oldest son, and he now realizes, well, it's like my father, Zichrono Livracha, used to always say to us, he says, the younger children always are looking up to the older children. The younger children, isn't it true in a family? The younger children watch the older children. That's a part of the chinuch process. Ruvain now realizes, Rav Soloveitchik says, he was the oldest son, and his younger brothers were all watching him back in last week's parsha. And what did they see? They saw the oldest son have chutzpah for the father, have undermined the authority of Yaakov. And though it was a minor move in the bigger picture of things, it had major ramifications, and Ruvain only realizes them now. When he did what he did in last week's parsha, he didn't realize that. Now he sees that by undermining the authority of his father, it has enormous consequences. This all became apparent to him when he hears the brothers willing to talk about killing Yosef. To suggest this is not only a manifestation of a terrible act of immorality, but it also demonstrates that they have no concern for whom? For Yaakov. They have no concern for their father. They have no concern for their father's judgment. What did Yaakov do with Yosef? Yaakov said Yosef is the leader. That's why he gave him the Ketonis Basim. That was a judgment call by Yaakov. We can argue that Yaakov made a mistake as a parent because he showed favoritism to one child over another, and it was so blatant. But nevertheless, it was a judgment call of the father. And so what are the brothers doing now? Reuven sees, oh my God, they saw me undermine my father, our father, and they now take it to an extreme, which tends to be what happens, right? We take a lesson and then we exaggerate it way beyond what they should be. So to suggest this, that they can kill Yosef, Reuven finally sees the ramifications of what he did back in the early Parsha. So now Reuven has to face the responsibility of being the one who taught them that they can undermine their father's authority. That's how the Rav brilliantly fuses these two midrashim into one unbelievable picture. I saw these two midrashim, I would never fuse them together. I never understood how these midrashim go hand in hand. Now the Rav weaves it together, and the Rav shows us it's one picture, all connected. What Reuven? Why isn't Reuven by the boar? Well, the Medrash answers it because Reuven finally realizes what he did in last week's parsha is causing this week's story, if you will, the sale of Yosef. Because you can only do the sale of Yosef if you undermined your father's authority. You would never have been able to ever consider selling Yosef or killing Yosef, God forbid, if you took your father into account, if you had a derech eretz for your father. So Reuven realizes that he is the one who, if you will, planted the seeds for all that is now transpiring. And he takes responsibility for it. What we're seeing is what we call the rippling effect. The rippling effect that the Medrash, or once I heard another rabbi call it the Midrashic echo, the echo of the Medrash. The Medrash is echoing through the story, right? It's exactly what he's suggesting. That's how the Rav is understanding it. It's a rippling effect being noted by the Medrash, and it connects the two stories together. Continue on. And then the Rav goes to Pasuk Lamed Aleph. Let's see what they do to demonstrate how far they go. So what do? In Pasuk Lamed Aleph, Vayikhu es ketonet Yosef. You have to feel the tempo in this Pasuk. Vayikhu es ketonet Yosef. What do? They take the coat of Yosef, right? Vayishchatu sir izim. Then they do what? They're act. Act one, they had ripped off the ketonet from their brother. Now they're holding the ketonet, right? What do with the cloak of many colors? They now, vayishchetu sirizim, they shecht the animal, vayitbelu et hakutonot, and they immerse the coat, badam, into the blood. And then the next pasuk, what do they do then? Vayishalchu et kitonet hapasim, vayoviu el aviem, vayomru zos matzanu, hakerna hakitonas binchohi imlo. And they bring it to the father and they say, Dad, can you recognize this? Do you hear the cynicism? Do you hear the critical voice that they're really saying in their voice? Hakerna. Do you realize they're blaming their father? That's what they're doing. Dad, you thought you could choose Yosef above us? Do you realize what you've done? You're to be blamed. All that we did is because of you. It's unbelievable. The Rav notes that this act of dipping the coat that Yaakov had given Yosef was the ultimate rebuke of the sons for the father. The ultimate, not only rebuke, the ultimate demonstration that the father no longer had authority. A parent is not to show favoritism, they're teaching their father. It's true. A parent should not show favoritism over one over the other, if at all possible, right? As much as possible, we shouldn't show favoritism, 100%. Here, Yaakov did not hide that one iota. It is true. Yaakov did a parental mistake. There's no question about it. But but it was a judgment call on Yaakov's part. Yaakov was demonstrating by giving the Ketonet Pasim to Yosef, that Yosef was going to be the manhig. Yosef was going to be the leader. And what are they doing? What are they doing in this pasuk? The Rav says they rip it, they dip it in blood, they show it to their father, and what are they saying? Dad, we reject your judgment call. This coat will never be able to be used again. That's what they're saying. They're saying it's ended. Yosef's rule over us has ended. You wanted Yosef to be the leader. Yosef is not going to be the leader. The future impact of Yosef is over. It's totally ripped. It's totally torn. It's dipped in blood. It never can be used again. So they are doing a rejection, an ultimate rejection of their father's judgment in totality here. And that's what's happening in this pasuk. Now let's take a look. So how does Yaakov respond to all of this? Well, take a look in pasuk Lamed Hey. Vayakumu kol banov v'chol benosav and lenachamo, and all of his sons and daughters come to comfort him. Vayimain lihisnachem. He refuses to be comforted. Vayomer, and then he makes a statement. Ki ered el beni ovel sheola. Will I descend on account of my son? I will be a mourner to the grave, right? Ovel sheola vayef oso aviv. And he cries. The Rav views this statement of Yaakov not just as a father mourning for a son. The worst tragedy, no question about it, is a parent burying a child. That is not the natural process. The natural process is parents go first, not children go first. Children are supposed to live longer lives after we go, after we leave this world. They're supposed to bury us, not we bury them. That's why what's going on in Eretz Yisrael is so tragic to all of us, right? That we see so many boys giving up their lives and their parents taking their children to the grave. It is beyond heart-wrenching. But the Rav views this statement not just as a father mourning the fact that a child predeceased him. It's much more than that. This is a sign of Yaakov. You have to pay attention to what Yaakov is really saying. You know what Yaakov is crying about? He's saying, I'm a total failure. I'm a total failure. Rashi suggests, citing the Medrash, that Hashem had given a sign to Yaakov. The sign was, if none of his children would predecease him, he would be spared Gehenna. The Medrash says that. The Medrash says that Yaakov was given a sign from Hashem that if all of his sons would live and they would be the ones that bury him, that would be the sign that Yaakov would not experience Gehenna. Well, now, what is Yaakov seeing? One of the 12 and his most precious son is gone. And he's the one who thinks that he's dead, correct? Well, what's going on here? Wondering what the meaning of this medrash is. What's the meaning? A medrash you always have to analyze. We know that. The Rav explained the following. Every one of us is brought into this world by HaKadosh Baruch Hu we're shlichei Hashem. We're shlichim. We're agents of the Almighty. Each and every one of us has a different role to play in this world. Each and every one of us has your role, my role. Each one has your unique job. Each of us has to be an agent of Hashem on this earth. And that's what we're supposed to do. Yaakov was given an agency too. What Yaakov's shlichus was to create Knesset Yisrael, the congregation called Klal Yisrael. Yaakov was going to build Knesset Yisrael. How many children were going to build Knesset Yisrael? How many were going to be important to creating Knesset Yisrael? 12 Shiftei Ka, 12 sons. That was the mission of Yaakov. Yaakov was to raise Knesset Yisrael. It's to be comprised of 12 children, 12 sons, numerous different talents, numerous different approaches, and different outlooks. And every one of them was required to build Knesset Yisrael. In the Rav's words, it is a metaphysical unity. Knesset Yisrael is a metaphysical unity. Yaakov understood that even if 11 remaining sons were all righteous, without all 12, Knesset Yisrael could not arise. With Yosef dead, Yaakov would have failed in his assignment. Now read that pasuk through the eyes of what the Rav just said. Well, let's take a look at this pasuk, right? Vayakumu kol banov v'chol ben asov l'nachamo. The sons and daughters came to comfort it. Vayima ein lehisnachem, and he refused to be comforted. Was it just a father that had a son predecease him? No. Vayomer ki ered el beni ovel she'ola. Am I going down to my grave as a total failure? I was supposed to have 12 sons create Knesset Yisrael. When one reads this insight, right, Yaakov hears the tremendous, you hear now, Yaakov's tremendous despondency. Yaakov is expressing much more than just mourning a child. He's mourning his whole shlichus, his whole purpose in living. He says, what is it? What's left to me? Nothing. I have failed. I have failed. I have failed. I am outright a failure. If Yosef dies before me, if any of the Bnei Yaakov die before me, I have not fulfilled the shlichus, the agency that I was brought into this world to do. And this can also be understood from the fact that Yaakov did not pronounce Yosef as the leader. And with his death, that clearly never happened, right? This also is understood from the fact that Yaakov pronounced Yosef as the leader. Yaakov pronounces Yosef as the leader. And with his death, that never can happen. If Yosef is dead, then his pronunciation, his appointment of Yosef as the leader also failed. And the emotions of this pasuk are so powerful. From 2 points, he feels a failure. And from the third point, it's just the pragmatic point that Yaakov had a son predecease him, right? In his thinking, that's what he's happening here. But he feels he's, number one, a failure by his shlichus. He's supposed to create Knesset Yisrael in its totality. It's a metaphysical unit that needs to be created with all 12 sons all together. And number two, he appointed Yosef as the leader. If Yosef is dead, that means his appointment has failed. And that's what's happening in this pasuk. Wow, this is a very powerful pasuk of despondency, of avelut on so many levels that Yaakov is expressing. So let's go back and just wrap up for this aliyah and how the Rav understood it. The Rav viewed it telling us, well, we're seeing a whole different perspective of Yosef and Yehuda, the two personalities that were now, this is the foreshadowing. This aliyah would be the foreshadowing for the rest of the story that's going to occupy us through the end of Chumash Bereshis. This parsha and the following 3 parshiot, all the way till Vayechi. It's all a story about Yosef and Yehuda. It's all a story about Yosef and Yehuda. Yosef and Yehuda are totally different personalities. And that's what the Rav is demonstrating this aliyah is painting for us. It's giving us an insight into the difference between Yosef and Yehuda. Yehuda can say, Ma betza, what is it worth that we should kill him? That's not smart. Let's sell him. Is this an act of morality? To a certain degree it is, but it lacks total morality. It's morality, like I gave you that example of Dr. Gromer saying Reb Chaim Brisker and Einstein. Both were moral people, but you couldn't compare the chesed, the morality of Reb Chaim to Einstein. It's 2 different worlds. Yosef had a built-in DNA of chesed. How do we know that? Well, you know the end of the story in Parshas Vayechi. The brothers are worried he's going to take revenge. It wasn't even in his mindset to take revenge. Yosef has a personality, a DNA of chesed, chesed, chesed. Morality, morality, morality. Yehuda is different. Yehuda is a pragmatic morality. Yehuda is the personality of Mabetza. It's not smart for us to kill him, but he's still cruel when he sells him. He still sells him as a hostage. Well, that's not total morality either. And that's what Chazal wanted us to understand. And Rav Soloveitchik points out that this is the foreshadowing to the rest of the story. Then the Rav wonders, well, what happens to the other son who was supposed to be a leader? By the way, Ruvain is a major failure. That we know. And that we know from Parshas Vayechi, when Yaakov gives the brachos to the children, and Yaakov talks about Ruvain. He talks about Ruvain as the one who is unstable like water. Ruvain can't be depended upon to be a leader. Ruvain makes terrible mistakes within the next three parshiot as well. We know that from the story, right, with Binyamin. He doesn't know how to handle the Binyamin. How does he take Binyamin? How does he get him back? How does he get Yaakov to agree to send Binyamin down? And it's not Ruvain who ever becomes the one who is able to defend Binyamin. It's Yehuda who tries to defend him. Vayikash, I love Yehuda. Yehuda comes to his defense. Okay. Anyhow, where is Ruvain? He's the one who suggested that they put him in the pit. Where did he go? Suddenly, when he's sold, he returns to the pit and he sees, oh, Ruvain's gone. Yosef is gone. So what's the question? The question is, where was he? So the Medrash says he was doing tshuva over what? Well, Rashi told us he was doing tshuva over the story from last week's parsha that he moved the bed of Bilhah to Rachel. What does that have to do with this? So the Rav explained, no, they are connected. When Ruvain did that minor act, he didn't realize the ramification of undermining his father's authority. And now he sees the results. When you begin undermining the authority, look at how far it can go. The rippling effect. That's exactly what happens. And that's how the Rav connects the two. And then they take the garment of Yosef and they dip it in blood. And they say, Hakerna. Dad, do you recognize this? When we read that story and you read it through the eyes of the Rav's interpretation, you understand, wow, what is happening here? They're saying to their father, Dad, we reject your thinking in totality. You're the one who thought Yosef would be our leader. What did they do? They take the ketonet, they take the manifestation of his leadership, they rip it, they dip it in blood, and they say, Dad, look at it. You're wrong, Dad. You're wrong, totally wrong. They reject their father's authority in totality. That's what's happening by their throwing the garment in front of their father and saying Hakerna. And then finally, Yaakov's response when he sees this, he's not just mourning a father, a son predeceasing a father. He's mourning the fact that he feels that he has failed on so many levels. Number one, he has failed on his appointment of Yosef. He was the one who appointed Yosef. Yosef's dead. That certainly didn't work. That was a failure. And number two, all of Knesset Yisrael was supposed to grow together to create Knesset Yisrael. And if one is gone, he has failed as well. Okay? So we see this as a foreshadowing to the rest of the story of Chumash Bereshis. A very important aliyah to understand the rest of the story of the next three parshiot. Okay?
Yeah, I have a question regarding the leadership. Wasn't Yehuda always supposed to be the leader? You know, he was
becomes the leader. Yehuda becomes the leader. Yes, he does. Yehuda does become both Yosef and Yehuda. And the men, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Yehuda does become a leader, 100%. Yes.
It,
But he
it
doesn't
seems,
have, Yehuda doesn't have the built-in, what the Rav is pointing out. Yehuda doesn't have the built-in chesed. It's not what defines him. And that's how you can understand. The next Aliyah in Parshas Vayeshev is what? The Yehuda and Tamar story. He's self-destructive. He does things that are self-destructive.
Yeah.
And that's what the Rav is pointing out. He's a very fascinating personality, Yehuda. Yes, Linda.
it seems like the whole aspect of murder or kidnapping is like almost de-emphasized through the Rav's interpretation. If you say, well, Reuven was busy doing tshuva, and Reuven doesn't exactly prioritize in a way that makes logical sense. He could have done tshuva after saving
100%. There's a time and a place.
Life. Right. And again, the whole aspect again of kidnapping or murder just kind of seems to be de-emphasized.
By whom? I'm not following.
By the Rav and following in his interpretation.
No, he said they are de-emphasizing it. They are. The kids are. 100%.
But even the reaction of well, the big thing here was that they weren't showing proper respect. Well, they weren't showing proper respect, but they were planning to murder him.
They undermine the authority, not only a respect. Respect, I wouldn't
realize.
Undermine the authority, undermine the judgment call of their father. That's what's happening. And that's how this leads one to another. You have a rippling effect. And that is why the medrash go hand in hand. What's Reuven realizing? Why would Reuven, your question is very good. Time and place. Now is the time to do tshuva. Do it later. No, because he now realizes, he faces the realization that what he did has this ramification. He didn't take that into account before.
And he didn't take into account the fact that his brother was sitting in a pit.
That's correct.
When he was busy doing tshuva. Reuven, he seems to not be able to anticipate what's going to happen.
That's correct. That's why Reuven can't be the leader. That's correct. That's why Reuven can't be the leader. That is 100% right. 100% right. Okay. We'll continue next week, Bezrat Hashem.
Yeah, I love the connection, though. It's fascinating, the connection of the two stories.
How the Rav
I think it's great.
Psukim is unbelievable. It gives me a whole new understanding how he fuses brilliantly all of these midrashim and the psukim, and then suddenly the psukim are read in a totally new light. Okay.
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Have a nice day. Have a nice day.
Feel well.
Thank you. Amen.
Feel good.
Amen. Thank you. Bye-bye.